In this video, I will be doing a detailed recap of Loki Season 2. I will be breaking down what I feel is the most important parts of each episode. I don't want this intro to be any longer, so on with the recap. We start the episode off with Loki running down the halls of the TVA, while Mobius and B-15 are chasing him because they don't recognize him. Loki jumps out the window and lands in a mail car. He rides it until the woman driving the car crashes into a He Who Remains statue, and then the car crashes through a window, and Loki falls out of the car and lands flat on his back inside another room of the TVA, which shocks everyone, especially Casey. An announcement comes on the intercom, letting everyone know that Loki is an intruder, and Casey is the one to let them know where Loki is. Loki then time slips into the future/present day TVA, and learns that he was just in the past inside the TVA, and asks Casey to help him, and asks him where Mobius and B-15 are. Then he time slips again. We then cut to Mobius and B-15 talking about how they are going to move forward with the TVA now that they've learned the truth about what they are doing there. Casey walks up to Mobius and B-15 and tells them that he saw Loki, and when Mobius tries to find out where Loki is, a TVA employee called Hunter X5 tells Mobius that he and B-15 are to see General Dox and Judge Gamble in the war room. In the war room, Dox, Mobius, Gamble, X5, and B-15 talk about B-15's decision to stop pruning timelines and what they are going to do next. Meanwhile, Loki time slips into the past TVA and walks into the war room and sees multiple statues of He Who Remains. Then listens to a recording of He Who Remains and Renslayer talking. Back in the war room, in the present-day TVA, Judge Gamble ends up deciding to stop pruning timelines and makes an announcement on the intercom for everyone to stop pruning the timelines. Loki then appears next to her, and he's panicking and tells everyone about HWR, and grabs X5's prune stick and uses it to reveal the HWR statues and tells them that he is the one that stole their lives and that he was just with Sylvie. Loki and Mobius then leave the room, and Dox tells X5 that they need to find Sylvie. Loki and Mobius talk about the events of Season 1, Episode 6, HWR, and about Loki's time slipping. Then Mobius takes Loki down to repairs and advancement to help Loki with the time slipping, where we meet Ouroboros, or OB for short. And Mobius, Loki, and OB talk about Loki's time slipping and figure out how to fix it. To fix it, they would need a temporal aura extractor, and that they would need to connect it to the temporal loom, and that Loki would have to prune himself, and then they would have to have someone pull Loki into the present from the timeline, using the extractor. Mobius, OB, and Loki then go down to the temporal loom room and go over the plan again. Then they do what they need to do in order to stop Loki's time slipping, which ends up being successful for the time being. At the end of the episode, we see General Dox and her hunters going to supposedly find Sylvie. Then in the credits scene, we see Sylvie on a branched timeline in the year 1982 in Broxton, Oklahoma, where she goes to McDonald's and starts her new life. This episode starts with Loki and Mobius in London in 1977 on the Sacred Timeline to look for X5, who is busy at a movie premiere, to see if he knows where Sylvie is. Mobius and Loki go talk to X5, who now goes by Brad, and he runs away with Loki chasing after him. Mobius and Loki end up catching Brad and taking him back to the TVA to interrogate him. But first, Mobius and Loki take Brad's modified tempad to OB to see what the tempad does. OB gives Loki the TVA guidebook to go figure it out on its own because OB is busy figuring out a solution to fix the loom. Then we cut to B-15 and Casey, who is working on trying to find Renslayer, but hasn't found her yet, but did find something else out. Then we cut to Loki and Mobius trying to figure out what's up with Brad's rigged TemPad. Then Casey and B-15 walk up to them, and Casey tells Mobius and Loki that he found out that Miss Minutes is helping Renslayer. Casey then handles the rigged TemPad, while B-15, Mobius, and Loki go to interrogate Brad, in which he is not cooperative and insults Loki and B-15, as well as Mobius, which causes Mobius to slap Brad. Then Loki and Mobius leave the room and go to eat pie and talk about things, then come up with a plan to get Brad to talk and to tell them where Sylvie is. We then flash to OB in the loom room, and he tries to sign into the system, but can't because only he who remains can access it. Then we cut to Brad. Then Loki and Mobius walk into the room with a giant machine. Then Mobius leaves the room, and Loki shuts and locks the door and uses the machine to squeeze Brad in an orange box until he eventually tells Loki where Sylvie went. And then Loki stops the machine, and Mobius walks in, and they reveal to Brad that it was part of their plan. Then we flash to Casey and B-15 walking into the loom room to find OB, and OB tells them that he can't access the system without HWR's temporal aura. But because he who remains is dead, they need to find Miss Minute so she can help them access the system. Then we cut to Brad, Loki, and Mobius arriving at the McDonald's in Broxton, Oklahoma, where Sylvie is. Loki goes to talk to Sylvie, who doesn't want anything to do with him or the TVA. While Loki and Sylvie talk outside, inside, Mobius and a nervous Brad talk until Mobius senses that Brad knows something that he, Loki, and Sylvie don't know. Then they go outside to where Loki and Sylvie are talking, and Brad tells them that they are all going to die. Then Sylvie looks into Brad's mind and finds out that General Dox is going to bomb every branch timeline, including Sylvie's. After they send Brad to the TVA, Loki, Mobius, and Sylvie go to stop Dox and her hunters, in which they arrest them. But they couldn't totally stop Dox from setting off the bombs because it was already happening when Loki, Sylvie, and Mobius arrive. Then Mobius and Loki go back to the TVA, where Sylvie follows behind, and everyone looks at the monitor that shows all the timelines that were destroyed and mourn the loss of those lives. Then a computer beeps, and Casey goes to check it and says that Renslayer's TemPad has been located. Loki turns to Sylvie, and Sylvie is mad that the TVA couldn't stop Dox, and tells Loki that the TVA is a rotten system and is the problem. Then she leaves to go back to her branch to see if it's still there. The episode ends with Sylvie back at her branch timeline, where she reflects on what just occurred. This episode begins with Renslayer walking through a time door into Chicago, Illinois in the year 1868 on the Sacred Timeline. She then goes into a barn where Miss Minutes is waiting for her. Miss Minutes tells Renslayer to put the package she brought with her in a window, where a young Victor Timely sees the package and opens it up, revealing a TVA guidebook, which was He Who Remains' contingency plan. Back at the TVA, Loki and the others discuss their new game plan, which is to locate Miss Minutes and Renslayer as well. Loki and Mobius go to Chicago, Illinois in the year 1868, but do not find Renslayer there. Then they go to the year 1893 in Chicago on a branch timeline to find Renslayer, and they arrive at the 1893 Chicago World Fair and look for Renslayer there. Mobius and Loki walk around and basically just fool around until they come across a sign that shows Victor Timely's showcase, titled Victor Timely's Astounding Temporal Marvels, and goes to check it out to see if Renslayer is there, which she is. When Victor Timely's showcase starts, Loki sees him and is afraid because Victor is a He Who Remains variant. Loki and Mobius decide that they should take Timely back with them to the TVA so he can help them sign into the TVA system so they can fix the loom. After the show, Loki and Mobius tried to talk to Victor, while Renslayer is also trying to talk to him. Then B-15 and Casey contact Mobius and tell him that someone has just arrived at the time period they are in, and it's Sylvie, who is there to kill Victor Timely. Loki tries to reason with her, and eventually Victor escapes with Miss Minutes and Renslayer. Victor takes them to his place in Chicago, and they talk for a little bit. Then they leave and hop on a boat and head to Victor's lab in Wisconsin. On the boat, Victor and Renslayer have a moment, and then she mentions the word partnership, which Victor does not do partners. Then Miss Minutes and Victor drop Renslayer, who is in a rowboat, into the water and ditch her. Then Miss Minutes and Victor arrive at his lab, and then Miss Minutes freaks Victor out and he turns her off. Renslayer then appears and tries to delete Victor with a prototype prune stick. When Mobius and Loki arrive to try to stop Renslayer, when Sylvie shows up and sends a magic blast at Victor, Renslayer, Loki, and Mobius, which sends them flying, and they all hit the ground. Sylvie then tries to kill Victor, but he begs her not to, saying that he can make his own choices, which convinces Sylvie to spare him. Sylvie tells Loki to take Victor and also tells him not to make her regret it. Then Loki and Mobius leave with Victor through a time door. Sylvie takes care of Renslayer by sending her to the Citadel at the end of time, which is falling apart. Renslayer summons Miss Minutes with her temp pad, and Miss Minutes then tells Renslayer that she knows something about her that will make her angry, and then the episode ends. We begin the episode where the last one left off at the Citadel, and Miss Minutes shows Renslayer a video of He Who Remains and Renslayer talking to each other in the Citadel after the Multiversal War. The video reveals to Renslayer that she was an integral part of helping He Who Remains win the war and part of the TVA. This makes Renslayer mad, and Miss Minutes suggests that they didn't need He Who Remains, and that maybe they never did. We cut to Victor in the TVA, and he walks around until Loki walks up to talk to him to try to get him to help fix the loom. They then all go down to OB, and he and Victor meet, and then they go over their next plan. The plan is for one of them to take the throughput multiplier down the gangway and load the multiplier into the launcher. Then they would hit the green button, which would launch the multiplier to the loom, and it will connect to it, which would help the loom manage the branches. OB then mentions that since last time Mobius was out on the gangway, the temporal radiation has increased by a lot, so the person who does this has to be quick. Then, Mobius, Loki, and Sylvie leave the room to go get pie, which Mobius suggests, but this makes Sylvie mad, and she calls him out for not wanting to go look to see what his life was like on the timeline. We then flash to Brad, Dox, and the other TVA employees with them, where Brad tries to convince everyone to work together to get out of the room they're in and on with their lives. Then, B-15 walks into the room and tries to get Dox to work with her, but isn't successful. Then we go to Loki and Sylvie, who are talking about the TVA and how they can make it better. We cut to Brad and the others again, when Renslayer and Miss Minutes show up to convince everyone to join them. Brad decides to join Renslayer and Miss Minutes, but the others refused and are then squeezed to death in the orange box thing, which thankfully we only hear and do not see it happen. OB, Casey, and Victor, meanwhile, are working on the multiplier when the temp pads stop working. Then, B-15 goes back to try to talk to Dox again, but discovers that she and the others who didn't join Renslayer aren't alive anymore. Then, Brad finds Victor and takes him to Renslayer. OB then discovers that Miss Minutes is taking over the system. Then Loki and the others meet in the hallway, where Loki comes to the conclusion that Renslayer is wanting to take control of the TVA. Loki and Sylvie then go to look for Victor, but are delayed by Miss Minutes. Eventually, Loki and Sylvie find Victor and take him down to the loom room, where OB and the others are waiting. Then they scan Victor Timely's temporal aura, and then he decides he should be the one to go out onto the gangway. He then gets his protective suit on, but when he steps outside, he immediately spaghettifies. Then the loom explodes and a giant white light flashes, and then it cuts to black and the episode ends. This episode begins where the last episode left off. We see Loki alone after the loom is destroyed and everything is reset. Loki then starts time-slipping again and walks around the TVA to look for everyone. Then a few minutes later, the TVA starts spaghettifying, and Loki grabs a TVA guidebook and stuffs it in his jacket pocket, and then he time-slips again. We are then shown Casey's life on the timeline in the year 1962 on a branched timeline in San Francisco, California. He is a prisoner named Frank who is escaping from Alcatraz prison. Then Loki time-slips to where Casey is. Then Loki time-slips to a few other locations until we see B-15 and who she is on the timeline. Then Loki time-slips in front of her. Then we see what Mobius's life is like on the timeline, and Loki appears there and talks to him for a few minutes, and then he time-slips again. And we see OB's life on the timeline. And then Loki appears in front of him, and they talk for a while about the TVA, Loki's time-slipping, and finding a solution so that Loki can get back to the TVA. OB suggests for Loki to try and control his time-slipping, and to get to the TVA that way, but Loki can't. So Loki suggests OB build a TemPad, but OB says he can't without the knowledge to do so. Then Loki remembers the TVA guidebook he put in his pocket earlier in the episode and gives it to OB so he can work on building a TemPad. Then Loki time-slips again and ends up back at Mobius's life on the timeline, and he talks to him until OB shows up. Then Loki goes to get everyone together. He does so, and they all head to OB's timeline. Then he realizes one person is missing, Sylvie. Then he goes to talk to her. He time-slips when he arrives to the McDonald's that Sylvie works at and immediately time-slips back to Sylvie, which implies that he's starting to take control of his time-slipping a little. Sylvie takes him to a bar and they talk about the TVA, and Loki thinks he should get the others to go back to the TVA. But Sylvie does not think so and feels that they should be able to live their lives. She asks Loki about what he truly wants, and he gives her wrong answers until he finally confesses that he wants his friends back because he doesn't know where he belongs if he doesn't have them. Sylvie then leaves the bar, leaving Loki there alone. Then Loki goes back to OB and the others and tells them to go back to their lives. Meanwhile, Sylvie is at a record store and she sits down on a couch and listens to a song, which we get to hear during this part of the episode. As Sylvie is listening to music, we see everything around her is spaghettifying. Then the record store owner calls for Sylvie's help, but he spaghettifies, and Sylvie watches her branch spaghettify until it's nothing but a black void of nothingness. Then she uses He Who Remains' TemPad and goes to where Loki and the others are, and lets Loki know that everything is falling apart. Then Loki realizes he has everyone there in order to get back to the TVA, and all they needed was to use the TemPad to get there. However, it has disappeared. They accuse Casey of stealing it, since they saw him steal something earlier, but he says he doesn't have it. Then everyone starts to spaghettify, and Loki is left alone with everything else spaghettifying. Then Loki time-slips and ends up back to where Sylvie walks in, and we see that he can finally control his time-slipping. Loki then time-slips into his past self at the TVA, right before Victor goes down to get prepared to go on the gangway, and the episode ends. This episode begins right where the last episode left off, with Loki time-slipping into his past self at the TVA, right before Victor goes down to get prepared to go onto the gangway. And the last scene of the 4th episode plays out, and Victor gets spaghettified. Loki asks OB what they could have done differently, and OB says that they weren't fast enough. So Loki goes back in time to before Victor heads out onto the gangway and rushes him out, but Victor still spaghettifies. So we then see a montage of Loki going back to the moment the episode began, and Victor gets spaghettified every time, until eventually Loki goes back to when Obi and Victor first meet and rush through that scene. Then he asks Obi how long it would take for him to know everything that Obi knows about mechanics, physics, and engineering. Obi says that it would take decades, but Victor says it would take centuries. So a card pops up on the screen that says centuries later. Then Loki gets Victor ready to go on the gangway, and this time Victor doesn't spaghettify and successfully launches the multiplier into the loom and gets back to the loom room unscathed. However, it only fixes the loom temporarily for like a minute or so. Loki is then confused and frustrated that it didn't work, and Victor says that it was a scaling problem, and that because of the infinite amount of branches, it's like trying to divide by zero. It doesn't work. Then Sylvie says maybe all this happened when the timelines first started branching, which Loki time slips back to the Citadel and the events of Season 1, Episode 6, to where before Sylvie kills He Who Remains. Loki then tries to convince Season 1, Episode 6 Sylvie not to kill He Who Remains, and that if she does, everything would be destroyed, in which she says, if you want to stop me, you'll have to kill me. We get another montage of sorts of Loki fighting Sylvie to stop her over and over, and every time she kills He Who Remains, until Loki gets frustrated and tells He Who Remains to do something, in which he uses his TemPad to pause Sylvie in place and swipes her away. He Who Remains and Loki talk, in which we find out that He Who Remains planned for everything to happen the way it did. He Who Remains then tells Loki to go through the conversation some more times and unpauses Sylvie. But Loki stops time and basically pauses Sylvie in place. He tells He Who Remains that he has had the conversation with him many times before. Then they talk about the loom, and He Who Remains says that the loom is a failsafe, and that if the TVA were to stop pruning timelines, then the loom would overload and would get destroyed along with the TVA. Then He Who Remains returns back to where he was before. Loki decides that he will change the equation, break the loom, and do something different. Then He Who Remains tells Loki that he really only has two options: break the loom and cause the chaos all over again, or to kill Sylvie and save what they can. Then Loki goes back to where he and Mobius first met and talk about his life and why he does what he does. Loki asks Mobius about how to choose who lives and who dies. Mobius tells Loki a story about having to make the hard choice and to keep the bigger picture in mind. Loki thanks Mobius for the advice, and then he goes back to just after everyone has spaghettified in episode 5, and pauses time and talks to Sylvie. She quickly figures out that Loki would have to kill her if he wanted to stop the loom from being destroyed. Loki asks Sylvie what he should do. Long story short, she says that people should be able to make their own choices, and that if Loki were to take that away, he would be replacing one nightmare with another, and that sometimes it's okay to destroy something. Then Loki adds, if there is hope that you can replace that thing with something better, which gives him an idea. He then goes back to before Victor gets ready to go down onto the gangway and takes one last look at his friends and goes down to the airlock. Sylvie and Mobius go down the stairs to go after Loki, but Loki locks the door and he tells them that he knows what he wants and what kind of god he needs to be for you, for all of us. Then Loki goes out onto the gangway and walks towards the loom and destroys it. Then the branches die, and he grabs hold of one of them and uses his magic to give it life, then lets go and it dies. So Loki grabs each branch and uses his magic to give them life again. Then he takes one more last look at his friends, and then he walks up the stairs he creates as he walks towards the Citadel, which is nothing but rubble. Grabbing more branches as he walks up, Then he walks towards He Who Remains' throne that is now his, and turns it to gold, and he sits down and gives life to all the branches, creating the Norse world tree, which I can't pronounce. We then go back to the TVA and catch up with the others. Then Mobius decides to leave the TVA and to go see what his life was like on the timeline. He does so and watches his variant from afar, and Sylvie walks up to him while he stands there, and she asks him what he's going to do, and Mobius says he's just going to sit and let time pass. We then flash to Loki, who hears Mobius, and he softly smiles, looking a little sad. Then we cut to black, and that's the end of episode 6 and the Loki series. Well, that brings us to the end of the video. I worked hard on creating this video. It took me a few days to make it, so I hope you enjoyed. It was a little long, but if you made it this far in the video, put 2 green hearts in the comments. And I'll see you in the next one.